speaker is Alex Fleetwood, here to talk about hardware, software, people, and games. And Alex is a designer, creative director, entrepreneur, and founder of a game studio, Hide and Seek. So, Alex.
Hello. Thank you to everyone on the Indiecade team for having me here in New York. It's wonderful to be here. We don't get cold like this in London, so it's bracing. It's exciting. So yeah, my name's Alex, marketing information. Please, if you have any comments or feedback about the talk, let me know. So I founded a game studio called Hide and Seek, and we invented new kinds of play. We had bases in London and New York. We did events, festivals, installations, commissions of many different kinds. And what we did, and what I'm particularly interested in and what I'm hoping to talk to you about today, is not just make games, but also make contexts in which to make games. So we curated and supported networks, we negotiated with institutions, we tried to find different ways to bring game making into different contexts in the UK and internationally. And this title, Hardware, Software, People, Games, is really trying to identify the bits of the network which I'm interested in laying out for you today in a bunch of different ways. And really, I guess what I'm hoping we'll do is not come out with any clear answers from this talk, but more sketch a kind of possibility space. An area of investigation that I think is tremendously interesting and has a huge amount of potential, both socially and culturally. Yeah, I'm interested to hear from you as to whether that resonates with you too. So I'm going to start with some ludicrously wild optimism. In the future, game culture will have moved alongside the other types of culture that lay claim to public space in our towns and cities. As well as cinemas, opera houses, art galleries, and theatres, there will be game spaces, places where the continuously evolving practice of games and play can be experienced as part of our civic life. There will be big ones, in places like Queens and Manchester and Tokyo and Hamburg, and smaller ones, anywhere where there are enough people to sustain them. Game spaces by the beach, game spaces in villages, game spaces nestled on the edge of national parks. In these game spaces, there will be people. People playing, people not playing, people doing whatever it is that they do. In doing this, they will gently lay to rest the ghost of the word gamer. Game playing will be a cultural literacy that will be taken for granted. In these game spaces, there will be things that operate like arcade machines, things that we can arrive and approach and play together that will have technology embedded in them, but wild and interesting technology with different kinds of interface and display and experience that we can barely imagine. There will also be people playing on personal devices, people playing with analog technologies, and there will be an ultra-flexible layer of infrastructure in these buildings, an internal skin that means that no matter where you want to plug something in to the power or the network, or wherever on the wall you want to hang something, it will be able to do so. These spaces will be welcoming and adaptive, able to admit different kinds of play, of players, of technologies. They will be liminal spaces where we can rehearse new identities and new ways of being together. These game spaces will coexist on a shared global network, enabling ideas, talent, artworks, and capital to flow freely. They will also be rooted in the specifics of their location. They will be places where scenes can happen, where people who want to think deeply about their practice can come and talk, and make and test their ideas in public. They will be destinations where the curious, the angry, the young, the old, where anybody will be able to visit and test their assumptions about what games are. This network will have a range of peers, some human, players, makers, curators, institutions, and some not. The software and hardware inside our augmented bodies, our personal devices, the installed machines, the infrastructure, and the building and the cities in which this all happens. The way that capital and assets will flow around this network will not be governed by the defensive structures of intellectual property. Instead, we will make a virtue of our creative abundance, granting real-time access to people networks, and experiences. These game spaces will operate in a landscape where games have been wholly, ineluctably embraced by politics and society as a vital aspect of our culture. They will be supported by national and maybe even supranational organizations who will care for games in other ways. They will take responsibility for archiving games and preserving hardware. They'll focus on education and ensuring equality of access to the tools of game making. In this landscape, it will be possible for game makers from diverse backgrounds to receive training, support, and encouragement at every stage of their career. They will be encouraged to develop an individual voice and to find ways of making their practice both scalable and sustainable. The nice thing about this optimistic vision is that we can see, I think, aspects of it already in the world. There's the incredible work of Baby Castles, now enshrined in a permanent space here in New York. Ian Simons and the team at Game City in Nottingham have successfully raised, I think, about £5 million to create a permanent hub for video game culture with public programs, education programs, archiving, and research. Thrilled to see Nikita here. I mean, I think the Mighty Killer Queen is a fantastically imaginative arcade game which is starting to seed in arcade spaces around the US, returning the idea of fresh thinking and innovation and creativity to spaces which I think have been stale for a really long time. You have Alt Control importing imaginative indie hardware, software, game design creations into the heart of the GDC Expo floor. You've got Wild Rumpus throwing amazing video game parties. As Richard the Marchant put it last year, your dancing represents real cultural change at GDC. And of course, I couldn't stand here without paying tribute to Indiecade at Indiecade East, which have done so much to bring humans who care about video game culture into contact with one another. But it feels like a lot of what we have right now is pretty temporary. It's pop-up. We make it, it happens, and it's done. It seems to me to speak to a culture where we're still operating in the margins of other people's systems and infrastructure. I think we're maybe stuck between a number of systems. On the one hand, we're at the margins of a games industry who still thinks games happen on screens, and those screens are either in your home or on your person. Any understanding of the social values of play culture is rooted through this screen-based design culture. This is a still from a concept demo that Microsoft put out about 18 months ago called Illumaroom, where they utilized 3D production technology to make a wall of your house into an extra bigger screen for your FPS. I think the idea of 3D projection technology has the potential to be really amazing, but not in somebody's house. Are you crazy? Like, are you really, like, who, you know, it's this crazy idea that somebody's got a big enough house and enough time and resources to put a 3D projector up on the wall. I actually once asked Microsoft Studio Director if they had considered that maybe the best use for these kinds of technology might be in shared social spaces, places where they can be installed and maintained, and where people can go to them and experience it in unique and interesting ways. And he kind of looked at me and said no, but the look on his face, it was like I'd asked a horse whether it would consider swimming to Rio. It was, you know, unlikely in the extreme. And on the other hand, we're at the margins of a civic and public art culture, which is quite literally not yet allocated any space for games. As Cara Ellison put it, currently speaking in the other room, Dana swears in the title, thank you for coming, I feel very honoured. The little lights of video game culture that we have are stitched together with love and the hope that one day we will have space and investment for them. Where are the monoliths built to our artists? My old studio, Hide and Seek, once mounted a festival of games at the National Theatre on the South Bank in London. They put us in the lobby. The purpose of the National Theatre is to mount plays. Everything about the architecture and the infrastructure of that building is geared around the production of theatre on a stage. If you want to put games in there, that space just makes no sense. It kind of rejects you. We put the games in, but they literally did not fit in that building. I also think that the platforms that we have for distributing games have important limitations in terms of the kinds of access and support that they create. As Greg Kostikian put in his GDC rant from last year, we're faced now with a scary landscape. Essentially monopolistic distribution channels that have total power over what gets distributed and what gets attention, with the power to demand whatever portion of the consumer dollar that they want. And there are a lot of things that we as independent game makers know make it difficult to make work on these platforms. Price is gradually tending to free, discovery is a nightmare, the marketing power of the big players dwarfs that of any other. 7 out of the top 10 grossing games on the App Store on Christmas Day in 2014 were the same games that were there in 2013. And I also think that these mass, undifferentiated global platforms have an effect on the appetites and expectations of players. It feels like it's given rise to a series of niches of different size. You get into the games that you get into, you find more games that are like that, and you cluster online with people who like the games that you like. And you get studios who end up super serving in order to maintain their place in this difficult ecosystem, the expectations and the needs of that online community. And as we've seen with Steam Early Access and many other instances, those expectations can become absurd. It feels also that there's this idea that the maker of that game is pretty interchangeable, and the only thing that really counts as far as the platform and the consumer are concerned is the content. I'm now going to steer hard left into a completely different thing and talk to you about the church that I go to. So, yeah, no, who was expecting church? Nobody, right? I go to a Unitarian church in North London in a place called Newington Green. It's kind of like the UUs, which I think you have around the US. Unitarianism has been a home for non-conformist churchgoers in my part of London since the 17th century. I go there because our atheist Jewish minister gives a great talk, because I like being part of a community that embraces progressive causes and social action, because I kind of like singing the cheesy Unitarian hymns that sound like rejects from the West Side Story Score, because my children get to go off for an hour and I get some time to, sit and not be a parent for a second. But I also go for something else, something which has become surprisingly important to me, which is to be with people that I did not choose to be with. At the beginning of our Sunday service, the minister says, no matter where you're from, or what you look like, or what you believe, what you love, there's a place for you here. And that's pretty great. And it's hard, because there's a lot of people in that room that I don't really like. I don't get on with them. They're different from me. They challenge me in all kinds of weird ways. And just turning up to this place, week in, week out, and being part of this funny space with these funny people, turns out to be an amazing pleasure. Because that community is much bigger than me and my dumb prejudices. And actually, having those revealed to me, and for the silly dumb prejudices that they are, is a really healthy and useful thing. And it's not just the community that is in that space now. A church has stood on this site and since the 1730s. Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, sat in the pew where I sit, as did Anna Letitia Bourbon, one of the primary campaigners of the abolition of slavery. We're warming the same pews as amazingly radical thinkers and campaigners. And the presence of this building, its continued presence, is imbued with their lives and works. And it's a tremendously useful and humbling experience to be reminded that they made the things that they did once be. And I hope it's not too much of a stretch to connect that to the memories that I have of video game arcades in the 80s. There's something about permanent spaces that make them accessible and cultural and embedded in a way that I don't think pop-up events can quite ever be. A British artist called David Sturman recently said this on Twitter. As passionate as young gamers are, it makes me sad to think that most will never experience a proper game arcade. All sound and light and colour. Nobody knew how arcade games were made, but they screamed newness and imagination in the drabness of the 1980s habitual English childhood. Arcades were great because they erased the difference between scruffy kids like me and posh tourist kids. All that mattered was information. Knowing how to do Major Bison's headstone was worth a lot in the pressure cooker of Winner Stays On Street Fighter 2. Arcades have been frequently misunderstood as places of vice, rather than genuine places accumulating traditions and communities of knowledge. And I get quite emotional when I hear that description, because I really remember going to those arcades with my dad and some friends, growing up in rural Suffolk, and these being places where thrilling, technologically mediated experiences that I cannot see anywhere else were happening. Watching other people play, other people, amazing skills, doing all these kind of incredible things. And I know that's only one side of what arcades are, and I'm editing heavily, but it's still something which I think we could interestingly reinvigorate. That there's something about that space that hasn't gone away. Just because we all have smartphones in our pockets now doesn't mean that we've lost the desire to get together in a physical place and find a technologically mediated experience which is surprising and delightful and extraordinary, and play it together and discover it and get good at it and find other people who are good at it. Or not, just be there. So, to kind of move into the last part of the talk, I want to connect these aspirational ideas and this social thinking with something which I think makes this quite a concrete opportunity right now. I don't just think that this would be nice, I think that this is actually amazingly possible, tangible, and requiring a degree of effort and energy, but something that can happen quite soon. And the reason that I think that is because a set of technologies and opportunities, which is usually referred to in kind of the business pages of the newspaper as the Internet of Things. Quick show of hands, how many people have a handle on the Internet of Things and what that is? Cool, pretty much everybody. I kind of don't. Like it's a surprise. Like it's one of those things you start pulling at, and it gets an awful lot more confusing. As I think is evidenced by this image, which is the first image that comes up on Google image search when you search Internet of Things. So what do we know about the Internet of Things? It's like maybe chips in livestock, or something about like the smart manufacturing, or sensors, or something with your fridge. Or as far as this picture is concerned, it's about getting your vacuum cleaner to talk to your printer, or maybe getting your angle poised lamp to talk to your oven. I actually been trying to think of the use case for angle poised lamps and ovens we're talking about. I think we can come up with that for a great time. And I think that there is something about the Internet of Things which it isn't yet, which is a unique experience, which is only made possible with the technologies that are presently available. And I think that we as game makers have a very interesting opportunity there. Because one thing that game makers have always done is express the potential of a new technology to a wider audience. Steve Russell and the team that made Space War in 1961 wanted to express what this new supercomputer could do, and the oscilloscope screen that he came up with. And they did it incredibly well. It was a way of describing to people who weren't experts, who weren't computer scientists, what this technology was all about. And I've been around making games for long enough to have seen that happen with smartphones, right? Like, 2008, there were smartphones, suddenly we're playing this game called Flight Control. Does anyone remember Flight Control, where you used to drag the planes around? It was like suddenly the first game was like, this isn't just a screen that is like a crappy version of a joypad. There's actually something interesting about it. And then very, very quickly, a bunch of design decisions and commercial decisions and strategic decisions get aggregated by small companies mostly into games which are tremendously successful on this new set of technology. And I think that that is about to happen again with the technologies that are associated with the Internet. So very briefly, what are those? Cloud services. I could probably have just said the Internet in that box. And then we have this idea of connected objects, the fact that this smartphone war in the last 7 years has resulted in an abundance of very cheap electronic hardware, sensors, processors, all the different bits. It's low power, it's small, and it's cheap to buy. There's then an important bit of Internet of Things, which is real-world use cases, which in our case is very straightforward and to do with arcades and game spaces. It is really worth noting that there are some other things. I've actually been making that kind of hardware, software, game design game, and it's incredibly easy and cheap to prototype with this stuff now. You have Arduino, you have all of these different 3D printing, all these different kind of things that make making this stuff and testing it very easily. And then I've been surprised through my own making process to discover that actually the process by which you scale that stuff into making 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 is now pretty well understood. It's not quite as easy as spinning up an Amazon web server to whatever scale you need it to, but it's getting there. And one of those technologies proposed to me is cheap, well-made, interesting, new arcade machines that we can put in arcade spaces, or in coffee shops, or in bars, or in co-working spaces, or in campuses. And those things are up to you, up to us, to imagine in terms of what they could be. But they are things that are novel, things that are surprising, that are fun, that are delightful, and things that you just couldn't do at home. They're things like the things that have been made at Baby Castles, and NYU Game Center, and at GDC, and Indiecade, and Wild Rumpus, and hide and seek. But now, we can do the things that the digital games industry can do. We can scale them, and we can distribute them, and we can maybe find ways of making them sustainable in terms of people wanting to pay for them. I am extremely interested in the idea that in a world where digital content is kind of relentlessly driving for free, but I think, as I said, it's bound up with the kind of entitlement culture that we have when we consume things alone and selfishly. Changes when we go into physical shared social spaces. Maybe spending $1 on an arcade game is something that we're still happy to do. So to wrap up, like I say, this is highly speculative. This is not a business plan. I hope there are no VCs or investors in the room, but I'll invest to ruin my chances. But I guess as somebody who operates on both sides of the kind of being a game maker and being an entrepreneur and being somebody who thinks about not just the content, but the whole stack, I think that there is this very exciting opportunity and a challenge, I think, for us as independent game makers to rethink independence as not something that just operates on a surface layer of a corporately owned substrate, but to truly think about independence through the hardware, the software, the people, and the games that we make, and the places that we make them. So I think there's a few things. One is the rise of the collaborative economy and peer-to-peer business models. I think we can decentralize and decorporatize this idea. A person can be a proprietor of an arcade space. They can pull in the latest big hit game from the guys who made Killer Queen or from some other talented maker that's sort of internationally famous, but they can also curate and develop games independently in their own community. I think that the costs of the hardware have changed really radically, and this is this kind of point about prototyping and manufacture and scale, and it's infinitely more modular. The ability to switch aspects of technology and hardware in and out to create new configurations or to repair and maintain things has got a lot more straightforward. I actually think also there are many fewer use cases for high street space right now. Like in a world where most of our shopping needs are fulfilled by Amazon and other online retailers, there are actually fewer reasons to go to those places. And I think if you go certainly outside of the hotspots, and for example to seaside towns, or to second cities, or to emerging, there's an awful lot of spaces that are theoretically accessible. I think there's a huge question, and the kind of validation of this idea is to do with whether or not all of that adds up to something sustainable. And ultimately that's something which is accessible by doing it, I guess, rather than standing up and talking about it. But I do think that there are genuine differences in conditions that make this difficult. I think there's also something for me about proclaiming a tone of voice for this stuff that isn't Chuck E. Cheese. This isn't, actually this stuff can be challenging and radical and exciting and fresh and surprising, and in a world where actually this sort of thing that we kind of cluster under the experience economy, where we want one-of-a-kind novel extraordinary experiences that other people aren't having. I think that this fits in with that if we have the courage to curate it and produce it in very highfalutin, serious, exciting way. There are 3 hands in the back, but I'm going to start with the front, the left of those hands in the back, then with a bit, I think it's Scott.
Yeah. So a space that sounds fantastic for your idea are libraries. Libraries in the US, makerspaces are growing in them like mad, but they don't know what to do with them. 75% of libraries already support games, and libraries are the place that curates local information content and tries to build community. So all the things you've just talked about actually fits right now with libraries who have makerspaces, but they don't know what to do with them. And this idea would be perfect to get folks in this room to go to their local libraries and say, hey, let's build something together that's relevant for our community.
I 100% agree. And I have worked inside a lot of makerspaces, and one of the things, like, this is not true of all makerspaces, but there is certainly a characteristic of makerspaces, which is they're really great if you're going there to make something, and you already know your way around a 3D printer and a laser cutter. But they're kind of shitty if you're just there as somebody in off the street, because there's no program, there's no kind of cultural curated program that explains what this stuff does. And I very strongly believe that these kinds of games are a fantastically straightforward way of showing the value of the things that you can do. So yeah,
Yes. Can you talk about how sort of these shared game playing spaces contributes to game development and making games?
Sure. So I guess when you say game development, you mean video game development?
Or any kind of game development, yeah.
Well, I would hope that the kind of peer-to-peer sharing network that I'm talking about would, I certainly know that I've derived enormous value from making and thinking about games in the presence of an interesting and diverse group of peers. And that I've learned a lot from a lot of different people, and I really value that opportunity. So I think destinations where you can go to play new stuff, try things, show things. We already have a ton of that, right, in terms of incubators and co-working spaces and campuses and all those things. But I think that the idea that you have somewhere to go and try stuff out is really useful. I think in the same way that it's logical that these things would be adjacent to makerspaces, it's logical that they might be adjacent to game studio co-working spaces or incubators or different kinds of things. There could be sort of reciprocal relationships between them. I don't know, the cause of game development is pretty broad, so I guess I think maybe one thing to say is that I genuinely believe that the culture that informs game development has to unlearn an awful lot of stuff to do with screen-based design. That I think that the next century is a lot less about screens and a lot more about embodied experiences where the relationship between digital and physical is sophisticated and balanced in interesting ways. And I think Google Glass is a great example of a technology which failed atrociously because of the screen-dominant thinking inside that organization. They just didn't have another idea, so they stuck a screen in front of your eye. and make this work. Anyone could have told you that, right? Like, if I'm going to put a big screen here, really? That's not going to work. It's evident unless you're dug into that. So maybe a generic advantage to game development is to show that non-screen mediated modes of experience are valuable. Okay, so guessing that. Okay, so maybe one more question. Okay, so this gentleman at the very back.
Now, I have a question regarding, I know it sounds kind of strange, but architecture. Now, with regards to creating like a shared space for games, thinking about this physically, what do you imagine that such a space might look like? Can you imagine like little booths that people would go into?
Right. I think it's a great question. So, I'm reluctant to answer it literally, but I can kind of answer it conceptually, which is, I think, plasticity. The idea that the space would be as mutable as possible, and the idea that the internal infrastructure of the space is organized around gameplay would be the things that I would write in a brief for an architecture competition. So take the space that we're in, right? The infrastructure and the technology of the space is geared around making images appear on that screen. And there's a whole bunch of backroom technology and stuff, and everything points that way. Now, if you've ever made games in a cinema or theatre space, you'll know that you can only make certain kinds of games in them because the kind of the building's technology point you in this very specific way. So the thing about games is they appropriate infrastructure and reuse it and mix it and propose very different uses of it. So you kind of have to think, well, how do we enable that to the greatest degree? What is it that we have in our space that allows for that to be as possible as possible? Great. I'm around afterwards. If anyone would like to ask more questions, I'd be delighted. But say, please tweet me with any more, and I will endeavour to answer them.